Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Carney, I heard you bring up life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yes, sir.
It seems like that's a pretty basic principle here.
One would think so, sir, yeah.
And Ms. Nguyen, you brought up kind of the credo of, one of the credos of Nike. And by the way, I've been to the campus there in Beaverton. It is unbelievable. Whatever, all these credos that you have there seem to be working pretty good. And yours is bringing their full selves to work. Was that right? How did you put that?
An inclusive environment where people are bringing their full selves to work, yes.
Okay. Now, it seems like the result of not having this law is that people can't bring their full selves to work.
Right.
If they're fearing, I could get fired, I could get harassed, I could be sort of driven out of my job by an unfriendly environment if I let everybody know who I was. So you feel like you get productivity from people when they bring their full selves to work.
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
But it seems like not having ENDA means that people aren't able to bring their full selves to work. And I just wonder about the loss in productivity and what you see in the gain in productivity at Nike by people being able to bring their full selves to work.
Yeah, that's a great question. For us, the heart of Nike is innovation, is around innovation. And we firmly believe, as I mentioned, that diversity is one of those key levers that keeps Nike on the leading edge of innovation. And if we are not creating an environment that is inclusive and celebrates diversity and is able to tap into all the diverse perspectives that our wealth of talent brings, then we suffer. Our innovation suffers, our creativity suffers, and our morale suffers.
So in a way, what we're doing by not letting people be themselves in the workplace is suppressing productivity.
Yes. People are not going to be giving their all, essentially, or playing at the top of their game in the workplace, okay, if they're not comfortable with being who they are in the workplace.
Professor Norton, I want to ask you a question. Mr. Parshall, I want you to be able to respond to it. So I might go over my time, but not anywhere near as much as Senator Merkley. But I'm not a lawyer. I'm one of the few members of this committee that isn't, but I did some research and I discovered that most Americans aren't. So I'm representing them. But as I was hearing Mr. Parshall talk about Title VII and the exemption, the religious exemption, which you heard all these different religious groups in Oregon said commended and signed on to. These are national. Or those are national groups, sorry. It seemed like the distinction, he was making a kind of distinction. He was saying that the exemption is built around what the person is being discriminated against, like in Title VII, which is race or gender, as opposed to defining the kind of organization that's exempt. And it seems like, I mean, I'm not a lawyer again, and so I want you to speak to this, Mr. Parshall, but it seems like you're kind of making a false distinction here. That Title VII was basically defining what kind of organization and what the kinds of organization are that are exempt, and not really defining what the thing you can't be prejudiced against is. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because I'm not saying it's so great.
I understand you very, very well, Senator Franken. Thank you for the question. I respectfully but strongly disagree with Mr. Parshall's description of the religious exemption and how it works. Title VII, you're exactly right, defines a range of institutions that are exempt from Title VII's prohibition on religious discrimination. There's two provisions. One exempts religious corporations, associations, educational institutions, and societies. They, if you fall into that category of institutions, you may discriminate on the basis of religion without running afoul of Title VII. Title VII has another exemption for educational institutions that don't fall into that earlier exemption, but nonetheless are in whole or in substantial part owned, controlled, managed, or operated by a religious institution, or that have a curriculum that's directed towards the propagation of a religion. Again, if you fall in that category of institutions, you are relieved from Title VII's prohibition on religious discrimination. Now, if you fall into either of those categories, you must still comply with the remainder of Title VII, which means you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, color, sex, or national origin. ENDA very clearly, Section 6 is very clear, that this act shall not apply. This act, which prohibits sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination, shall not apply to those institutions that are exempt under Title VII. So, once this bill becomes law, if you fall into one of the religious institution exemptions, you are relieved from Title VII's prohibition on religious discrimination, and you are relieved from ENDA's prohibition on sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination, period.
Okay, and so Mr. Parshall, I want you to respond to that. Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry about this, but I'd like you to respond to that, Mr. Parshall. I'm over my time, and I wouldn't mind if you had a chance to respond to the response, okay?
Thank you for your fundamental fairness, Senator. I appreciate that.
Fundamental fairness would have me allowing you to respond to her response to your response.
Sometimes
and I'm not going to do that.
Sometimes we lawyers enjoy a refreshing non-lawyer's perspective and getting down to the bottom of the bottom line. And I think you've just touched on it. What does Title VII really exempt? You've hit on part of it, but not all of it. Number one, the nature of the organization. And it has a list: religious corporations, institutions, educational, and so forth. That describes the nature of the organization. That's one inquiry. But there's a second prong that the courts apply, and that is, number one, are you a religious organization falling within Title VII's language? But number two, what is the focus of your conduct? The cases have said if your focus is to discriminate based on race or sex or gender, the exemption doesn't apply. But if it's directed to the faith or lack of the employee, then we have a collision between faith, and that's where the exemption kicks in. Now, the problem is, if a homosexual or lesbian or transgender person applies at a Christian bookstore, as an example, and they say, we're not going to hire you, and let's say they say, we aren't hiring you because of your sexual orientation, the courts will look at the language, and I'm just going to quote one case, there's a Third Circuit case, Third Circuit Court of Appeals, that interprets the religious exemption under Title VII this way. And I quote, the statute exempts religious entities and educational organizations from its non-discrimination mandate to the extent that an employment decision, and this is the important part, is based on the individual's, that is the employee or prospective employee's, religious preferences. So if a person of sexual orientation that doesn't happen to coincide with the religious beliefs of a Christian bookstore or a Christian publisher says, well, I'm a Lutheran, this is a Lutheran publishing company, no problem. You don't have an exemption. But if they says, I'm an atheist and a transgender, then the Christian publishing might have an exemption. That's part of the confusion that I think occurs by Section 6 just simply importing the whole Title VII scheme.
Okay, I think I understand that, and can I just have a brief response to that? And okay.
Yes, sir. Again, I respectfully but strongly disagree with Mr. Parshall's characterization. Title VII first asks, do you fall into one of these institutional categories? If so, you're relieved from the prohibition on religious discrimination. And if so, Section 6 of ENDA is completely clear that you're also relieved of the prohibition on discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity.
But he's saying that religious discrimination is discriminating against the person's religious beliefs, as opposed to discriminating against their gender or sexual orientation or their gender identification.
Sure, those are different things. But the significance of the exemption in ENDA is that if, for example, we'll just use the example he used, if you are a Lutheran religious institution, actually, I don't want to pick on Lutherans. There's many in Minnesota and Iowa and elsewhere.
They're great. They're terrific.
If you're I'm a Lutheran. If you're a religious institution
Yeah.
within the meaning of Title VII, you are free from ENDA. So it's okay if you say, I'm discriminating against him or her because it's okay as a legal standard, not as a moral standpoint.
I've actually gone further over my time in Senator Merkley. So,
Far over.
yeah.
Far over.
Okay, thank you, Senator, and that just took more time, didn't it? But why don't you guys talk between yourselves and settle this and let us know how it came out? Mr. Chairman?